Welcome to Caravan, the Art of Wayfaring podcast that tells the stories of people and places in Turkey.
For the bibliophile, that is, somebody who loves books, a used bookstore is like a mystery box. With no allegiance to any particular publisher or genre or even specific areas of literature, second-hand bookstores can become the temporary resting place of great treasures or the final shelf of volumes that no one's interested in. Walking into one is a different experience from walking into another. Customers comb through piles and lean over to browse the titles etched into book spines on that search for the diamond hidden among the dross. I love used bookstores. I keep a list on my phone of titles I'm more likely to find used than new, just in case I happen to pass one by that I've never gone into. On one cool spring day, I turned into a bookstore located in one of the oldest neighborhoods in Istanbul. Samatya Sahaf doesn't have much to distinguish it when seen from the street, except a yellow and black sign advertising secondhand books in 5 different languages. Josh and I stepped in and became acquainted with the owner as I started to browse the shelves. Like most used bookstores around the world, stepping into Samatya Sahaf is like stepping into a submarine that's been recommissioned as a library. Books are stacked from floor to ceiling on every available surface. The passage is narrow and there is a faint smell of aging paper. After I told the shopkeeper what I was looking for, he stood up from the stool where he had been drinking his tea and began to run his hands over a few titles and make recommendations as he quickly scanned the English section. He pulled out a few from a nearby shelf for me to peruse before he sat back down to finish his tea. A run-of-the-mill experience in a fairly familiar setting. Any of that could have happened in 1,000 different bookstores in 1,000 different cities on Earth. Except for one thing. Devrim, the shopkeeper, is totally blind. This man whose career is devoted to the written page has never set his eyes on the inside of a book. Devrim's story doesn't start in the bookstore, or even in Istanbul, actually. He's not the product of an intellectual family that encouraged him to push past his disability, nor was there a time when he could actually see as a child that allowed him to fall in love with books before he lost his sight. Instead, his story starts in a rural village outside the city of Eskişehir. Devrim was born into a very poor Turkish family. Life began on a type of farm. If you drive through the Turkish countryside, you'll see many that resemble his old farm today. Unlike North American farms, most fields here are hand-planted, hand-weeded, and hand-harvested. Farmers might have a tractor and some other simple equipment, but there can be no question that it's the human labor that makes up most of the capacity of one of these small family operations. The women in Devrim's family worked in the fields. You can imagine portly Turkish women in their colorful shalvar, which maybe we would call in English harem pants, bent over at the waist and working in long rows of vegetables. Life was hard, but not just because of the work. There were 6 kids in the immediate family, so there was very little space to go around in the small house. Cousins and friends came to the house regularly and stayed over too. No one in the family had their own bedroom even, or their own bed. When you got tired, you would just find a place to sleep, much of the time sweating between 2 other people through the hot Anatolian nights. After hearing about these conditions, you can imagine that the Turkish families that live that way tend to be really close. This is, after all, a collectivist culture. Parents and elders hold authority over decisions that most Westerners would give to the individual. For instance, when it comes time to get married, you're not just marrying a bride, you're marrying a whole new family. Parents meet to discuss the engagement before it even becomes official. The whole community knows about your relationship and your intentions, and often openly shares their opinions with you. This close family tie is strength to many and bondage for others. Devrim's family was less stable than other rural Turkish households. Even as a toddler, he doesn't remember people giving him any particular help or any extra attention. Who taught him about life? Oh, no one, it seems. Which is a little unusual, isn't it? One would think that a blind child would warrant some extra care. But not in Devrim's case. One day, he recounts, he was playing in the yard and some friends and some siblings started playing with him. They loved to run and play tag, but he could never understand why the other kids were so much better at it than him. For Devrim, it was frustrating to be caught so easily and to have such a hard time catching the others. What's more is that there was a small open pit in the yard where he would often fall into while he was chasing the other kids. In addition to tag and foot races, the children also play soccer and other outdoor games together. When Devrim was still too young to go to school, he remembers a game of dodgeball that would change his life. Before the kids started playing, it seemed like it was going to be a day just like any other. Like in the West, captains were selected, or they elected themselves, and they began to choose teammates from the others who had gathered to play. Devrim, feeling a little knot of anger at the coming injustice, knew that, as usual, he was going to be picked last. And he was right. This time, though, his frustration got the best of him. "Why do you always leave me till last?" he shouted in indignation. One of the kids, with typical childish tactlessness, said to him, "Because you're blind, of course." Devrim hesitated. Blind? What does that mean? See, no one, not in his family, not one of his friends, no one had ever told him that he was blind. There was no one to help him to learn to navigate the world using his other senses. There was no one to cover the open pit in their yard or steer him away from the other dangers that lurked around the corner on the family farm. Devrim dropped out of the game, and over the coming days, he came to learn that there were people who could see and people who couldn't. And I can imagine in his little child's brain that he didn't even have a clear understanding of what that meant for his life. But as some of the implications of his handicap started to sink in, one of the biggest mysteries that he had faced already in his young life began to take shape. He had always been fascinated by books. He describes his family farm as backwater and his family is very ignorant, so it should come as no surprise that there weren't many books to be found in his home. But that didn't stop him from being absolutely fascinated as a child. He knew that there were stories and knowledge locked up on pages that were inaccessible to his sightless eyes. He would run his hands over anything with embossed printing on them and try and discern what letters must look like. He knew people could see the shapes and take meaning from them, but having never learned to read and having no one close by that would read to him, he just imagined that the letters were more like hieroglyphs. That is to say, that pictures represented the things and concepts that they were trying to convey. He and one of his sisters would sit down with children's books that they would find or borrow from friends and try and understand what they meant. But when they asked their father to buy some books to keep in the house, the father would always reply, "Time and money spent on books is thrown in the trash." As you can understand, it didn't comfort him as a young child to have an explanation for why he couldn't see the letters in the books or why he couldn't keep up with the other kids. It didn't make him any better at tag or dodgeball or soccer. All he knew now was that he was broken and that no one in his family or immediate friend group had taken the time to try and understand and help him. His first reaction was anger. How could this happen to me? How could God and how could the world be so unjust, he thought. Why is my family so unfeeling? Later, his rage smoldered down, and it became a deep disappointment. He says that he even felt his spirit break a little. If I'm this way now, what does life hold for me? Up until that point, life had been hard, and it had been lonely. Once, while he was talking about what it was like growing up in this particular household, he lifted up his shirt to reveal a thick white scar and said cryptically, "Behold, the evidence of my family." But it's at this point of deep darkness, with no prospect of help, that we have to pull back the curtain and take a look at the fate and the calling that seems like it was handed down divinely to Devrim. His name actually means revolution. And now you need to know that it's not the kind of name that would be given in the type of household where he grew up. And frankly, it's not much in keeping with general Turkish worldview, but it was prophetic in a sense. It was in the midst of that depression and self-pity that Devrim had his first personal revolution. To deal with the neglect and the mistreatment that he faced in his family and a future of living with a serious handicap, he formed a personal philosophy that would guide him through all the turbulence of the coming years. In his own words, Devrim said, "In order to live a life free of handicaps, one must learn to live a life of understanding and imagination." Contrary to the illiteracy and the ignorance of his family, he would search for truth and wisdom, he decided. And contrary to the dark cage of his blindness, he also decided to live in a world of rich vision. Eventually, Devrim's family applied to have him sent to school for the blind. One would think that escaping the difficult circumstances of his early childhood would come as a relief. But the school was, according to him, violent and traumatic. He hints at abuse from the teachers and openly talks about the bullying and the beatings other students would inflict on one another. His circumstances changed, but they were no easier than they were before. But the one gift that school did give him was opening up the world that he had longed to get into. Books. Early on, he was taught Braille, and once he learned enough through his fingertips, it wasn't long before he was devouring a book a day. The internal world that he had begun to cultivate was suddenly flooded with new ideas, stories, lands, facts, and peoples. Soon he was able to add audiobooks to the list as well, and years later, devices that would scan printed pages and play back an audio recording of what was written there. As we sat together in his shop, I glanced down at the screen of his computer. Today, his web browser will read text from a page to him, in addition to all his other tools. But Devrim still calls himself a book lover, not just a reading lover. Despite all the digital advances, he loves the smell and the sound of the pages of an old book. Many years passed as he bounced back between boarding school and summers back on the farm. He grew up separated from his family, both by personality and by passions. The only relative he could relate to was a hard-drinking uncle that lived in town. Despite the conservative rural Turks around him, his uncle was a leftist. In the Turkish countryside, that's actually quite a rare thing. Their mutual love of learning and reading and free thought brought the two together. Time with that uncle watered the seeds of justice advocacy in Devrim's heart. Later, his uncle's influence would also throw his life into an unexpected direction. But we're not there yet. After high school came university. From rustic farm in Izmir to the school for the blind in the capital city of Ankara, Devrim's story suddenly pushed him into the ancient metropolis of Istanbul. Urbanization is a force all over the world, but the effect that it has on the people of Turkey is particularly stark. Now, I've spoken with people who have never been more than 100 kilometers away from the village that they were born in. They eat and sleep and breathe their small town life and shake their heads at the pace and insanity of the world outside. Turkish Anatolia is still home to many deeply traditional ways of life that seem like the only right way for the people who live there. Travel from one central province to another might bring a few superficial changes in the way that people live and think and talk, but the contrast is relatively small. Enter Istanbul. Even the smallest buildings in an average neighborhood in this city rise to at least 4 stories tall. Crowds fill the streets on every evening of the week. Bus and metro and taxis and ferries carry over 2 million people through the winding streets and over the Bosphorus every day. It's a far cry for Devrim from the boarding school or the farmyard of his childhood. He was accepted into a fairly prestigious university, Istanbul University, in fact, located in the heart of the old city. The university itself was started in 1453, the same year that Sultan Mehmet conquered the Greek people and brought an end to the Byzantine Empire. Now, almost 600 years later, it would become the home to a young blind man from the village who loved to learn. Devrim was drawn to the humanities, likely due to his past and the ideological leanings he inherited from his uncle. He studied international relations and was able to continue his love of books and reading through his university studies. As I've already mentioned, big city Istanbul was totally different from the environment he grew up in, but the change was a welcome one. The cosmopolitan makeup of the city meant that Devrim could be free from the abuse and the ignorance he suffered at home and at school. It didn't take him long to make friends through the intellectual and artistic subcultures of the city. When his formal education came to an end, he found himself a job working in the Ottoman archives. The Ottoman Empire was home to a nation of scrupulous note-takers who left behind piles of records that are still being combed through today. For Devrim, the child who had been captivated by the idea of treasure hidden as ideas and stories on pages, sandwiched into books, translating the archives was an easy fit. He stayed there for 8 years, but then Turkey changed. In 2013, a massive protest broke out in the heart of the city in a place named Gezi Park. At first, it was a crowd of environmentalists protesting the transformation of the park into more commercial zoning, but it very quickly evolved into a general outcry against established political authorities. In the ensuing months, the protests would draw millions of people and spread to the public squares of many other cities in the country. One face in the crowd belonged to Devrim. By the time the Gezi demonstrations began, Devrim was already well known in the advocacy and the protest community. The Turkish Green Party and the leftist parties knew him by name. He says that he had already taken to the streets to join his voice with other people speaking out against climate change and war and human rights violations. He had been in marches, he had joined political movements, and he'd even spoken on panels within the community. But this protest felt different, not only to him, but to many of the others involved. Soon riots broke out and clashes with police began, and the demonstration evolved into an occupation. The drama of the moment drew the media in masses, not just from Turkey, but from around the world, which, in a twist of fate, would cast Devrim's life in yet another unexpected direction. One day, during the protests, a photographer from a major paper took his picture as he was being arrested for protesting. In a sea of thousands of people and likely thousands of pictures on that reporter's camera that day, it was Devrim's face that stood out. His picture was slapped on the front page of a major paper, and that paper found its way to the desk of his employer. After 8 years in the Ottoman archives, he was fired for his involvement in the protests. His superiors at work labeled him a looter and a traitor to the nation and relieved him of his post. Now jobless, Devrim would need to do something fast. His options were limited because of his disability, but he was creative. Yes, there were regular life expenses like rent and groceries and utilities, but on top of that, Devrim was also facing charges for his involvement in the riots. He found himself paying legal and court fees. Being a leftist didn't carry as much stigma in Istanbul as it did in the Old Village, of course, but the job market was flooded by others who had been fired for the same reasons. And the violence of the protests soured many potential employers against hiring anyone who had been involved. Devrim made the decision to fall back on the two things he loved most, his friends and his books. He made a list and he called everyone he could think of and asked them to donate books, and he combined everything he got with his own personal library and created a stock for a used bookstore. By the time he opened, Devrim had gathered and cataloged 1,500 volumes. He rented a space across from the well-known Armenian church in his home district of Samatya. The shop belonged to the church, and when he told them what he wanted to do, they said they would gladly rent it to him. The only books that he held back for himself in his personal library were the ones that had been given as gifts or had been signed by the author. It was there that I met him. Now, 6 years after opening, that's where he can still be found. We sat inside his shop for about half an hour, then made our way down the street and sat a little more. Devrim is warm and friendly. When you're with him, you don't feel any of that regular social polite distance. It's more like you've known each other for a while and the social masks kind of melt off. He knows his shop so well and he loves his books so much that when I asked if he's got anything on any one of 3 different topics, he stands up and easily makes me and Josh a little pile of titles to consider from books taken from a dozen shelves from around the store. He tells us that when he reads, he doesn't think in what he believes to be black and white or colors, even though, of course, that's just his best guess, having never seen them. He says that shades and foggy representations of different shapes come together as he brings the pages to life in his mind. He also says that according to other blind people he's spoken with, some who once had sight but later become blind find that the color of their memories begins to fade and their imagination turns to grayscale. Just another little insight into the life of the blind bookseller. Devrim chooses to sell books written from perspectives and in languages that many Turks would find offensive and that are generally not sold in other stores. In a similar vein, he's trying to collect embossed letter and braille books that are endangered due to the new technologies coming out for blind people. Because he entered into a bit of a niche market, and because of where his shop is and the rise of online shopping, Although sales have never been great, today sales are actually dropping off. Samatya is a district that's a little off the beaten path for most tourists who come to Istanbul, or even for people who are searching for used books. And many Turks don't prefer to read at all. Once again, it seems like today, Devrim's future is becoming uncertain. As we talk about the people that we've come across in our lifetimes, I start to wonder what will happen to Devrim. He's very smart and he's famous in a certain sense, at least well known. The uncertainty of being without a family does seem quite difficult. If his store closes, what will he do next, I think? I was surprised many times sitting and listening to his story, first from the lack of support he had as a child, and later at how he came to own his own used bookstore. There was a strong element to the unexpected and this idea of a constant twist of fate in the stories that he told. Months later, shortly before I recorded this story, I was sitting with friends in another city on the Black Sea. We were eating supper and chatting while the TV played in the background. It was a rerun from the week before and it looked like a game show. I wasn't watching much, but then something familiar caught my eye. It was the hat. It was Devrim's distinctive hat. And of course, it was him on the show. He was competing on some kind of trivia show. I got excited and explained how I knew him to my friends, and we decided to watch for a few minutes. He charmed the crowd, and he demonstrated how much he'd absorbed by reading voraciously for decades. Yet again, just another twist of fate in the life of the blind bookseller. Caravan is written, produced, and recorded by me, Sean Stevenson Douglas. Music was written and performed by our good friend Tarık Yılmaz. If you want to hear more about life and adventures in Turkey, find us on Facebook and Twitter or visit www.artofwayfaring.com. You'll find fresh content posted weekly on our website.